right, we are right on the dot at 1 o'clock Central, so I'm going to go ahead and get started and people can sort of roll in as we go. So first, I want to welcome everyone and thank you all for joining us today for the webinar, Renewable Natural Gas for Home Heating, a False Solution. My name is Kaylee O'Brien, and I am Illinois PIRG Education Fund's Clean Energy Associate, and I'm hosting this webinar on behalf of the U.S. PIRG Education Fund. Through research, public education and outreach, U.S. PIRG Education Fund serves as a counterweight to the influence of powerful special interests, that threaten our health, safety, and well-being. As a heads up to everyone, this meeting is being recorded, and we will share the recording and the slides being presented after the meeting. So our goals for today for our attendees are to educate everyone on what renewable natural gas, or RNG, actually is and how it functions, as well as the consumer and environmental impacts of it. We will aim to unpack the utility argument for RNG on its merits and discuss how this results in excessive fossil fuel spending on infrastructure. Finally, we'll wrap up with a discussion of what role, if any, there is for RNG in the decarbonization of home heating in the future. Our agenda is as follows. We'll begin with a discussion of, or a contextualization of renewable natural gas in Illinois and briefly introduce our speakers before passing it over to each of our speakers to do a brief presentation, after which point we will have a moderated discussion and then open the floor for questions. When you are asking questions, I ask that you use the Zoom Q&A answer function, Zoom question and answer function. And note that you can ask questions at any time, but that we will not pause for questions until that end section. With that, I'd like to start by discussing how RNG shows up in Illinois. So first, I want to note that Illinois is in the middle of a Future of Gas proceeding. Our Future of Gas proceeding is initiated by utility regulators at the Illinois Commerce Commission, and the proceeding is designed to do just that, investigate the future of gas in the state and what issues may arise when trying to decarbonize a gas distribution system. The proceeding is premised on the idea that climate emissions in the gas utility sector should eventually go to zero, and most environmental and public interest groups, including ourselves, believe that the best route to do that is through electrification and a renewable electric grid. However, gas utilities believe that fuels like so-called renewable natural gas are our best path forward. And crucially, this method allows them to maintain their current business practices, and as we will discuss later, it does not hold up well under scrutiny. We are joined today by three panelists, Michael Walsh, Dr. Robert Howarth, and Jaimini Parekh. Michael Walsh is the co-founder of Groundwork Data and a deep decarbonization planner who specializes in renewable natural gas. Dr. Howarth is a professor of ecology and environmental biology at Cornell University and an expert on the environmental impact of biofuels and methane. And finally, Jaimini is a senior attorney with Earthjustice who writes and works on the dishonest marketing practices of gas utilities. With that, I will hand it over to our first speaker, Michael Walsh, to begin his presentation.
All right, thank you, Kaylee. And I've just sent you, Kaylee, a request to turn screen sharing on. And if you just give me a minute to get that up here, I will start our show. Thank you for having us, Illinois PIRG. I'm Michael Walsh. I am a Massachusetts-based deep decarbonization consultant. I am one of the two co-founders of Groundwork Data. And I will just, there it is. Thank you. Thank you for your patience there. And we are a public interest advisory, research, and technology firm supporting the clean, equitable, and reliable energy transition. And we've taken some expertise from our team members in state and local integrated decarbonization planning, gas pipeline economics and policy, urban infrastructure, to really develop a firm that's focused on advising state and public interest stakeholders on questions around the future of heat, gas transition planning, and the smart use of sustainable fuels pertinent to today. As you can see, we published a number of reports focused on the future of gas, titled The Future of Gas, one of which is in Illinois, one of which was specifically relevant to People's Gas in Chicago. And we're really excited to be here again today with one of our collaborators, Illinois PIRG, who gave us some really helpful advice on these reports, but also recognize the sort of broad interest of the audience today. We talk about these issues broadly in a number of states and at the national scale as well. You can take a look at our research at that website and dive much deeper into these topics than I have time to today. We focus on questions around the future of gas. And in a lot of our work, we start off with this figure, emphasizing that there are three disruptors to the gas system that are changing the paradigm for how we've thought about gas. Historically, gas has been the cheapest fuel around, but the reality is gas will never be as cheap as it is today. And that's for three key reasons. First, in many states and municipalities, we have aging gas pipeline infrastructure, and modernizing that for safety and reliability is costing billions of dollars across the country. Second, climate policy at the state, federal, local, individual, and institutional level are all shifting consumers away from the gas system. You can imagine that this is the incentives at the state level or at the federal level, offering consumers access to heat pumps and whatnot. Those incentives are driving consumers away from gas and will likely do so over the course of the next several decades. And thirdly, those technologies provide new consumer value pretty well in a way that technology such as renewable natural gas does not. And that competition also pulls consumers away. So that increasing cost gets concentrated on a declining customer base and declining consumption. And under our current rate-making practices and principles, that will drive up costs for those who remain on the gas system going forward in the future, and further incentivizing them to leave the system. And so we are very concerned about this potential disruption to the gas system. It is going to be very consequential for the system under our feet, which does have some significant health and safety implications if it's not managed appropriately. Our ultimate goal here, recognizing that there are a lot of challenges to implementing some of these new technologies, is preserving affordability across the system overall. And that's where we are very skeptical of technologies such as RNG. It is just not a tool for preserving affordability while achieving our climate goals. I want to start off and just very quickly touch upon this. There are a number of definitions for the technologies and the fuels that we're talking about here. Some of them that get very nuanced, but I do want to recognize that there are a couple terms that are used in the space. I think we oftentimes just refer to it as renewable natural gas because that's what the public has been hearing left and right, and sometimes switching between some of these terms is a little bit troublesome at times. But we do want to recognize that there's some other terms that are out there. We also want to note there are two processes, a biological process called anaerobic digestion and another process called gasification. And the feedstocks associated with those, and the cost associated with those processes are actually really important distinctions that we might come into as we discuss this in our question and answer session later. But I wanted to emphasize that there are sort of two general sort of ways of generating RNG, a biological pathway and thermochemical pathway called gasification. We took a look at sort of proposals in Illinois by the gas utilities and the National Gas Association, the American Gas Association, trying to get a sense of where they saw the future of gas going with respect to RNG. And you typically see some sort of proposals such as this right here. A number of feedstocks, whether they be landfill gas, manure, wastewater, food waste, woody crops and residues, and even energy crops on land currently used for corn or soy biofuel, be taken and put through some of these processes and then transformed ultimately into renewable natural gas. And to get to the scales needed to replace gas at currently today, you would actually need to rely on the land currently used for energy crops such as corn and soy biofuel in a state such as Illinois there. So you can see that this diagram here with the dashed lines really show the sort of residential and commercial in the inner circle, and the Illinois gas use in that total Illinois gas use in that outer circle, really on the same scale as this sort of using energy crops proposal that's out there. And those other strategies just really don't reach to that scale at all. So there are some really important questions about how these sort of feedstocks can scale to meet demand or meet renewable natural gas demand going forward in the future. We also emphasized in that report, in the Future of Gas in Illinois, that there are a number of other pathways and a number of potential uses for transforming some of these resources into energy and non-energy products, whether they be electricity and heat, which has a higher value than methane, carbon sequestration, liquid fuels such as sustainable aviation fuels, chemicals, and fertilizer. I note there's a big debate out there on whether or not to use these bioenergy resources for some of these products here. But we do want to emphasize that there are many pathways, and depending upon how these technologies evolve, how climate policy prioritizes each of them, those pathways and those products are going to be in competition with renewable natural gas for those feedstocks, limiting the applicability of those feedstocks to serving heat and end use needs in the commercial and residential sector. I want to just kind of show you what some of these products look like. On the bottom right-hand corner here is a typical anaerobic digester. I think in that case, that one is actually a one that's powering an electric generation combined heat and power plant facility. The one above is an organics pre-processing facility. The upper left, you can actually process food waste in your own home now, in your kitchen, with this contraption called the mill, and it basically grinds up and dehydrates your food waste into effectively compost or even chicken feed. Right down there on the bottom left is a picture of a potential hydrothermal liquefaction facility. So taking those feedstocks again and turning it into sustainable aviation fuels or some other liquid fuel that again has a higher value than gas. Again, trade-offs associated with it. I want to note that we look into some of these waste transformation processes, and we see opportunity in developing sort of local scale solutions for transforming what we call waste to X, transforming waste to resources that can be used to provide energy or to provide some other other benefits. And in Illinois, we've seen this actually play out in a way that can involve the community. This Green Era campus on the Chicago South Side transformed a blighted impound lot into an urban organic waste management facility. And it brought the community together to plan it out and create a number of community resources for it. It does anaerobically digest local organic waste and turns that into pipeline gas, as well as what's called a renewable identification number. And that's an important credit that the federal government offers for dedicating that renewable natural gas attribute to transportation fuels. And I'll get to a little bit of the nuance about that in a minute, but it's that RIN that actually costs, that sort of provides the value for building a facility such as this. And that is the way that renewable natural gas is heavily subsidized today. This is actually a clipping from a filing in New York, where a renewable natural gas facility, New York City, was developed at a wastewater treatment plant here. And going into this, you actually see that the total cost of producing the renewable natural gas at that facility was about $30. About 90% of that cost was subsidized by these RINs, by policy actually based in California. And this demonstrates sort of one of the key challenges with RNG. It is expensive relative to the cost of fossil gas, oftentimes 10 times as much so. And the only way it gets produced in these situations is by offering it substantial subsidies. And just to emphasize here, and you can go into our Future Gas in Illinois report and just see how we walk this through. For a producer that's basically gathering all that feedstock together, transforming it, building the capital facilities that are needed to transform that feedstock into a fuel, it's more likely and it's more economically advantageous for them to produce a sort of liquid fuel such as sustainable aviation fuel rather than renewable natural gas. It's just a much lower cost hurdle to get over for that sustainable aviation fuel. And to get to that renewable fuel, these columns that are showing sort of the costs that go into making that renewable fuel in each case, there's less of a gap between the fossil fuel cost in that situation and the fossil fuel cost of fossil methane. That for a producer of these fuels, there's actually a lot more value created if you're going down that liquid fuel pathway overall. And so it makes sense, and this is emphasized in a number of national scale sustainability reports out there, such as Net Zero America study, that you've got to prioritize these limited resources for sort of those high value fuel products if you're going to try to valorize them. Want to dive into a quick myth quickly, and many folks out there will say that renewable natural gas has a negative carbon intensity. It's peddled by industry, it's peddled by consultants supporting those industry, and this is because California did a little bit of a life cycle analysis trick with renewable natural gas. it credited the sort of the avoided methane emissions from transforming dairy manure into renewable natural gas, as a sort of negative value or a negative credit. That helps them to kind of create, address some agricultural scale policy, but it's not a sustainable or scalable strategy overall. And if you wanted to talk about ways of avoiding methane emissions, and I'll admit this, I eat too much ice cream. If I don't eat that ice cream cone or that bowl of ice cream that I do at least once a week, I could avoid significant amount of methane emissions as well. But there's no subsidy for that in this case. This is just to say that there is an important sort of and very wonky discussion going on right now, particularly in California, about this sort of value of this intensity and whether or not it's something that needs to be applied going forward. But it is something that is oftentimes used by industry to kind of mislead and create a misconception about renewable natural gas. The reality is there's a very limited amount of RNG that could be used in this way, even still. Finally, I want to wrap up by saying renewable natural gas doesn't create new value. You're spending a lot to make it. Again, that $30 per MMBTU, is relatively expensive, and it's going to distort the economics of heating as it's blended in, as it's sort of applied to the cost of gas overall. It would actually triple in many cases the cost that consumers actually have to pay for their gas, and they get nothing for it on their home side. When you talk about heat pumps right now, that modularity allows for zoning, it provides cooling. You can get additional building, efficiency improvements when you install those heat pumps that can improve occupant comfort and productivity. Induction cooktop stove are easier to clean, reduces pollutants, and new technology out there right now is actually pretty cool in terms of how you can use a induction stovetop. The new combo and washer dryers, right now I'm looking to get a new one because it's going to be more convenient. RNG does not create these sort of values, and so there needs to be an understanding that yes, some of these steps needed to electrify are going to be expensive. RNG is also expensive, but those steps to electrification also create new consumer value that benefit consumers. So I usually give this talk sometimes over a half hour. I've given a talk, a 90-minute version of this talk. Happy to go into a number of other details over the course of the question and answer session later. But thanks for listening so far, and thanks to Illinois Parekh for having me. So I'm happy to turn it back to Kaylee to take back over here.
Thank you, Michael. If you all will give me 1 second to share my screen. All right. Here we are, and then I will hand it over to Dr. Howarth. Please just let me know when you want the slide changed.
Okay, thank you, Kaylee. I don't see my slides though. We're still on Michael's slides, at least in my screen.
Michael, you have to stop sharing.
All right, there you go. And I'll just tell you when it's time to proceed. Why don't we jump right to the second slide, please? I was asked to give just a brief introduction, explaining who I am. I'm a Earth system scientist. I've worked at Cornell for a long, long time. I've worked on climate change consequences also for a long time, and I'm best known in some circles for my work on methane, how that contributes to climate change, and methane emissions from oil and gas industry. I've published life cycle assessments on blue hydrogen made from fossil gas with carbon capture, and on LNG, and President Biden used my life cycle assessment to put a pause on LNG a year ago. I've worked extensively on biofuels as well. I chaired something called the International Biofuels Project for the International Council of Science for 5 years. We pulled together 75 scientists and engineers from around the world to look at the environmental consequences of biofuels. And I'm a member of the New York State Climate Action Council. I'll say a little bit more about that in a minute. And I'm an academic, so I publish, and I've published a fair amount. I'm actually one of the top most cited environmental scientists in the world. Next slide, please. I wanted to say a little bit about New York State Climate Action Council. I'm bringing a New York State context to RNG here. In New York, we have the very progressive climate law, the Climate Leadership and Community Protection Act of 2019. It calls for the state going carbon neutral by 2050, but perhaps more importantly, reducing our greenhouse gas emissions from all economic sectors by 40% by 2030. And it doesn't say precisely how to do that. The law set up this group called the Climate Action Council to come up with the blueprint for it, a scoping plan, which was required by law to be produced 2 years ago. I'm one of the members of the council. There are 22 of us altogether. We worked very, very hard on this, and I just want to emphasize that we're hardly a radical group. Many of the members are commissioners of various agencies in the state. Our co-chairs are the Commissioner of Environmental Conservation and the President of the New York State Energy and Research Development Authority. So next slide. So again, the Climate Action Council is charged by law with producing the blueprint for reaching our aggressive climate goals. And we spent a considerable amount of time discussing the role of renewable natural gas. We had a special working group met on that for 6 months. I was one of the members of it. We met weekly for hours at a time and debated the pros and cons. In the end, I'll just jump to the conclusion of that. The Climate Action Council says that the way to decarbonize the building sector in New York State is to go with heat pumps, beneficial electrification, as Michael just said. And we very strongly advised against renewable natural gas. In fact, we discourage any use of renewable natural gas. Now, Michael pointed out that there's a lot of language here, which is often used confusedly. The language he used is the same language that I'm using and the same language we used at the Climate Action Council. Biogas is what's produced, say, in an anaerobic digester, and it's a mixture of carbon dioxide and methane. Renewable natural gas is processed to remove that carbon dioxide in order to put it into pipelines. If you don't process the biogas, you can't put it in the pipeline. In the Climate Action Council, we said in the end, there's a role for biogas, a role for biomethane. It's limited, but we should not refine it should be RNG there, not LNG, sorry about that. And instead, the biogas should be used at the site of production, not put into the pipelines. We also said that biogas is a very limited resource. Next slide. So why did we say that we didn't want to process our renewable natural gas? It's because it takes a lot of energy to process and move that carbon dioxide, and there's a lot of methane emissions associated with that. Methane is an incredibly potent greenhouse gas, more than 80 times more powerful than carbon dioxide. And so you take biogas, which is a 50-50 mix of carbon dioxide and methane. You can use that on site as a fuel, but again, to put into a pipeline, to make it renewable natural gas, you got to remove that CO2, and it results in high methane emissions and loss of energy. It's inefficient. Next slide. So there's not a huge amount of data on what the methane emissions are with that processing in the US, but this review paper was published a few years ago, largely European sources, but that's where they've paid attention to this. Next slide. Their conclusion is that the methane loss from what they call biomethane is much higher than it is for conventional natural gas. And they're calling what they call biomethane is what we would call renewable natural gas. Bottom line is methane emissions look to be really, really high when you go through that processing. Next slide. And I did an analysis using that information for the Climate Action Council, and my conclusion was that the greenhouse gas footprint of renewable natural gas is 1.7 times larger than is the emissions from fossil natural gas. So this is hardly a carbon neutral fuel. It's a very, very high fuel. Biogas itself is a little problematic, but renewable natural gas is much, much worse. Next slide. We also looked in great detail at how much biogas or renewable natural gas could really be made in New York State. Next slide. And I'm going to go through this quickly. This is from presentations I gave to the Climate Action Council. I just want to show that there are data behind here. And I started by calculating how much, if we took all of the manure produced in New York State, which is a large, we're the third largest dairy state in the country. If we took all of that and used it very, very efficiently to make biogas, how much would that be? And next slide. Next slide again, please. The answer is 370 billion liters of methane per year. That probably doesn't mean anything to you, but it's less than 1% of our current use of fossil natural gas. And that's using very optimistic assumptions. So it's just from the manure, it's a very, very small resource. Next slide. If we took all the methane that's coming from landfills and from wastewater in the state, that makes up 1.7% of our current use of natural gas consumption in New York State. Next slide. And so from all possible sources of waste materials in the state, if we used it all to make biogas, it would come out to be 2.6% of our current consumption of natural gas. Again, it would be less than that if it actually became renewable natural gas, because there's an inefficiency. You're using some of the gas to do that processing. It's a small resource. Next slide. Now, industry sources say, oh, it could be a lot larger than that. Maybe we could make 30–40% of our current use of fossil gas for renewable natural gas. The only way that's possible is if we use waste sources, as Michael's discussing, or we use crops that are grown for energy, corn, soybeans, or things like that. Next slide. And we don't want to do that, is the bottom line. To the extent we have wood waste, it's much better to use it for pellets, for burning. That's a much more efficient source of energy, and it doesn't have methane emissions, which the renewable natural gas does. And next slide. And to the extent that, well, we don't want to use crops for energy, that runs against policy in New York State, because crops grown for any energy source have a very, very high greenhouse gas footprint. And when you put them into anaerobic digesters and the processing and all, it's just an unacceptably large source. So again, our conclusion was no renewable natural gas for pipelines in New York State. Biogas is a small resource. We should not be relying on gas pipeline distribution systems in the future for our heating. The future really is beneficial electrification. I think the next slide's my final one. Yeah. Thank you for the chance to participate in this today. I think this is a really important topic, and I hope that Illinois will follow what we're doing here in New York and not endorse RNG as part of the energy future. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Howard. Now we'll switch over to Jaimini's presentation.
Hi, everyone. My name is Jaimini. I'm an attorney with Earthjustice, and I focus on clean energy. A lot of what my focus has been in the past few years has been utility rate case proceedings, both on the electric and the gas side. A lot of the focus in that proceeding was on encouraging building electrification as the most cost-effective solution to decarbonizing buildings. So I'll start with just a big picture policy of why RNG is coming up. Gas utility service is a fuel of preference. Unlike electricity, which is a necessity, customers can choose to rely on either electricity or gas. And the gas companies know this. So they spend a lot of effort selling their product to customers. And RNG greenwashing is one of those things. And companies want their customers to think their product is environmentally friendly, to prevent regulation of their greenhouse gas emissions that harm our climate and our planet. And while RNG might make sense for difficult to electrify industrial customers, it does not make sense for residential or small commercial customers, which are the vast majority of the clientele for gas utilities. Residential customers provide nearly about 80% of a gas company's revenues. So where is this issue showing up? It is showing up in state policy with legislative pushes for climate regulation of energy utilities, showing up in utilities commissions, just like it's showing up in the Illinois proceeding, Future of Gas proceeding. It's showing up in building codes regulations that are encouraging the new construction standards for buildings that reduce greenhouse gas emissions. It's coming up through the state departments of energy that are encouraging heat pump incentive programs. And then it's also shown up at the local city level through gas bans, but that avenue of advocacy has been foreclosed substantially due to legal reasons. There was an industry challenge to that. That was unfortunately successful. So the three key things I'm going to focus on here for the rest of my talk is combating industry disinformation in advertising and other promotional activities, reducing investment in growth, and electrification as the least cost pathway to decarbonization. Next slide, please. So industry misinformation. I had started by talking about how RNG is a greenwashing campaign. And that's really what we have seen out here in the Northwest. A lot of people in the Northwest are very environmentally focused, very concerned about climate change. They want to see the companies that they buy services from are taking action to reduce their environmental footprint. And so this is what we saw from Northwest Natural, which is an Oregon public utility. This was an extensive advertising campaign that they had called the Less We Can campaign. It was spent a lot of money on it. The goal of that campaign was to influence the perspectives of their customers to think that gas is something that is not harmful to the climate. And they were able to successfully do that through this campaign. The reason why this is highly problematic is some of this advertising is straight up misinformation. So on the right is one example of that, where you have this advertisement saying, oh, we have this, this renewable storage capacity that's larger than a $2 trillion battery. That's the renewable storage capacity that our gas system has. Well, guess how much of that gas is renewable? None. There is no gas that is stored in this storage facility that is renewable, and yet they are advertising it as if it is a renewable resource. So that is plain misinformation and a greenwashing attempt. The other thing that we see are advertisements like this, which is advertising the product of gas as being renewable. And why do I say this is greenwashing? Well, for the first reason, there is no gas that is being transmitted in the pipeline to customers that is renewable. The gas investments that this company have made into renewable natural gas are in North Dakota. So they basically purchase renewable thermal credits for a very tiny portion of their gas demand. And that gas is being used in North Dakota. It is not reaching customers. And so we went after this advertising in the proceeding because the company was trying to recover costs for this advertising from ratepayers. And so we sought to disallow these expenditures as promotional advertising that should not be recoverable from ratepayers. And the last thing I'll say on industry misinformation is they're not telling you there's another way that you could advertise this, which is cooking with cow farts, right? Like, who wants to use cow farts to cook with? Nobody has promoted that as an advertising campaign, but maybe that's what we should be doing to advertise against renewable natural gas, to kind of highlight the problem of this industry. All right, next slide. So the next problem with RNG is that it is insanely expensive. So we saw presentations from Mr. Walsh, Dr. Howarth, both showing that RNG is not a resource that can decarbonize the entire gas demand for a utility, and it is exceptionally expensive. And so these estimates that I have put up here on the slide are estimates that were provided by utilities on the right. These are estimates that were developed by E3, a consulting company for Puget Sound Energy. And it shows that RNG costs are upwards of $20 per MMBTU. And even in the optimistic case, in 2050, the costs are going to remain high. And in comparison, Northwest Natural, in its recent filing, they estimated, they said it was conservative, but it was actually quite a generous assumption that the cost of RNG is $22 per decatherm, which is about the same as MMBTU. So very expensive when you compare that to the cost of natural gas, which currently is about $4. And when you think about this as an alternative to decarbonize the system, it's going to cost customers a lot of money to invest in the amount of RNG that would be needed to decarbonize the energy demand for the utility. And that's not the worst part. The worst, it gets worse in the sense that if you only rely on alternative fuels like RNG, synthetic methane, or hydrogen to decarbonize the demand, you cannot fully decarbonize a gas utility only on RNG. You have to rely on synthetic methane, on hydrogen, on these types of fuels, which are even more expensive than RNG. And in the case of synthetic methane, it's not even a commercially viable fuel. It has not been used as a commercial fuel by gas utilities. And so it is a highly speculative fuel. But in order to fully decarbonize the utilities' the gas demand that is currently existing, so that's not including growth, just looking at the current demand, and to decarbonize that current demand, you are going to need to rely on synthetic methane, on green hydrogen, and RNG, using very optimistic assumptions that these resources are going to be available. It's just not a feasible option. So what are advocates really trying to do about this? This has come up in the rate case proceedings, specifically through trying to get rid of line extension allowances. Line extension allowances are basically a subsidy, a per customer subsidy that utilities receive to connect new customers to utility service. It is and what we've advocated for is to get rid of these subsidies because they are uneconomic. And when you compare them with electrification, it does not make sense to continue to invest in growth. At the very least, we should be thinking about pruning the gas system. All right, last slide, please. So, as I mentioned, electrification is the most effective way and most cost-effective way to decarbonize gas utility service. And this is something that we've seen here in Washington with Puget Sound Energy. The company did its own analysis of what would be the best way to decarbonize its gas utility service. And one of the biggest ways they themselves determined to do that would be to start electrifying their gas customers. And so through settlement in one of our rate cases, we got Puget Sound Energy to conduct a pilot program to electrify its existing gas residential customers. These are some of the outcomes from that pilot program. And it was very successful. The program ran out of money early. People really wanted to convert their home energy, specifically home heating systems. And they preferred heat pumps because they provide air conditioning. And so for areas where you have dual fuel utilities, electrification should be the #1 thing that you're thinking about when it comes to decarbonizing the gas utility service. And part of that would be for those dual fuel utilities to get rid of line extension allowances as well for the gas utility service, because it changes the economic calculus for gas growth. And so I know we're kind of running out of time here, so I will close by saying, these are some of the legal tools we pursued as attorneys, but there's lots of ways that you can push for these changes as advocates. You can engage in rate utility proceedings or future of gas proceedings, integrated resource planning proceedings. Those are all great ways to think about how do you start decarbonizing gas utilities. You can also engage in legislative pushes to regulate greenhouse gas emissions from utilities, require these utilities to reduce their climate harming emissions. And that is the real push for why you're seeing an increased emphasis on building electrification, because reliance on continued gas service is uneconomic once you start considering the climate footprint of that technology. And then the last thing I would highlight is that there are also legislative pushes to eliminate promotional and political spending by utilities, including on American Gas Association dues and getting those things out of rates. And while that is tangentially related to this conversation, it is also incredibly important because gas utilities get the money to greenwash the public about their image from the public, from ratepayers. And so it's really important to take away that power from them, because they shouldn't have the power to influence the public in a way that's going to harm the public. And so that's why it's really important to get political spending out of rates. And I will close there.
All right, thank you, Jaimini. And if the other panelists would like to come on video, we are going to now shift to a discussion section. So my first question, which I think we've discussed a fair amount in this presentation, is that I think everyone here would agree that it's better to capture fugitive methane emissions. So those are methane emissions that escape, and I guess burn them rather than allow them to escape to the atmosphere. So if we don't use these methane emissions in gas utilities, where should we be using them?
Let me take a crack at that. And yes, we definitely want to be capturing methane and not just letting it go to the atmosphere. But look at both the things coming out of landfills and the anaerobic digesters. As I mentioned, it's not pure methane by any means. It's a mixture. It's about half methane and half carbon dioxide. We can capture that. You can use it to power a fuel cell to produce electricity. You can burn it for local heat at the site where you're capturing it. You can run a generator off of it to make electricity. In order to put into a pipeline, you'd need to reduce that carbon dioxide hugely, and that takes a lot of energy. It's inefficient, and again, it increases the methane emissions. So yes, trap the methane, use it on site, don't process it, don't put it in pipelines.
I'll jump in and say there's a lot of optionality in this space. And the beautiful thing about Professor Howarth's recommendation just there of fuel cells, even though they need to be kind of, that technology needs to be kind of perfected a little bit more, is that they also generate a very pure stream of carbon dioxide, which can be captured and potentially sequestered as well. So there are many different options that are out there in terms of the wet waste, the manures, the wastewater sludge. You can turn that stuff into a bio oil, and even possibly put that bio oil into the ground and capture and sequester carbon, remove carbon from the atmosphere that way. With sort of those larger crops or dry waste that are out there, the pathways tend to be gasification, and that's when you get into the extreme trade-offs around cost, land use issues, and whatnot as well. So going down to the meat of this, though. Right now, gas costs about $2.50 to basically take out of the ground, fossil methane gas. You can probably take manure or yard waste or crop waste and turn that into that bio oil, for example, at a cheaper cost of turning that yard waste or dry waste or manure into renewable natural gas. And so there's an advantage of taking that resource and putting it in the ground rather than allocating it to renewable natural gas, for example. The tech and trade-offs here get a little complex at times, but there's a lot of rich optionality out there that policymakers should be considering.
Thank you. Oh, also, before I continue, I just want to say to the attendees, you're welcome to submit questions at any time. As for our next question, can you all please compare the effectiveness and specifically the cost effectiveness of renewable natural gas in terms of emissions reductions compared to alternative strategies like energy efficiency or, like Jamie suggested, electrification?
Yeah, I'll start. I'm sure both Michael and Jaimini have a lot to say here as well. But you know, the clear way that we should be moving forward to decarbonize heating in the building sector is electrification, heat pumps. And in New York, I think it makes actually more sense to have ground source heat pumps than air source heat pumps. But in any case, heat pumps. And as part of the background for our blueprint for the Climate Action Council plan in New York, we evaluated the cost of putting in heat pumps compared to the cost of using fossil natural gas and fossil fuels generally. And it actually is cost effective today in the state of New York for new construction to heat with heat pumps instead of fossil natural gas. The heat pumps are cheaper over the lifetime of the building, any reasonable time period you'd like to look at. That's fossil natural gas. Renewable natural gas, as we've heard repeatedly, is far, far more expensive than fossil natural gas. And so it makes absolutely no sense economically to be using renewable natural gas for that. The most cost-effective way and the best thing for the planet is beneficial electrification.
The gas companies out there love to talk about consumer choice and consumer choice in decarbonization. Hypothetically, we could give them that choice of now putting $30 to $40 per MMBTU onto the consumer. When you do that, you are likely to see consumers say, hey, this is getting too expensive for me, and start to leave in droves for, again, those heat pumps that provide modularity, that provide cooling, that are more efficient, that are more cost effective to operate at that price level for RNG than RNG. That cost of RNG just obviates the cost benefits that natural gas is providing, and really removes gas as a sort of cost competitive fuel in that.
Yeah, I think both of those comments are spot on. What we have seen is when you build, like, Dr. Howarth was saying, when you build new buildings from scratch, a new gas connection is going to cost a ratepayer more because they're going to pay more on their energy utility bills for paying, and they'll be paying for two bills, right? Their electric and their gas. If you build from scratch, you should be building electric. It is the most cost-effective option for customers and for ratepayers. And what we found through the pilot too is, and this is just existing gas, this is not RNG. What we found through the pilot that I had mentioned earlier is that the average greenhouse gas emissions per customer went down by approximately 20% by switching out their furnace to a heat pump. And these are findings from the utility that the utility presented to us. So 20% reduction by switching out your gas furnace for a heat pump. And there was a smaller reduction in actual energy utility bills, approximately 3% annual reduction in energy bills. And that it might be 3% now, but that might be higher if you have what Michael Walsh was talking about, which is runaway costs on the gas sector, because you're having a smaller number of customers as people start exiting the system, and also high expenditures associated with replacing pipelines, with investing in RNG and all these types of technologies, because again, gas is a preference. Once it starts becoming extremely expensive, people are going to say, shoot, why am I paying for two bills? Why am I paying thousands of dollars on my gas heating bill? I'm going to get a heat pump and I get air conditioning.
Thank you all. I'm going to do one more question here before we open it up, but this is more of a numbers game. But how much RNG could realistically be produced in the US annually? And what does that number represent in terms of the actual methane gas consumption of the country?
Well, let me take one more crack at that. I mean, I ran through the estimates quickly, but for New York, where we've done a thorough analysis, and if we rely on manure and we rely on wastewater treatment plants and on methane coming out of landfills, for New York, it's well under 3% of our current use of natural gas. It's hard to believe it would be any higher than that if we looked at the United States as a whole. It's an extremely limited resource. And the only way you're going to increase that is by taking other stocks to produce the methane. And Michael spent some time talking about that. We could use crops grown for energy, and you can make biomethane out of that if you want to, but it's an inefficient way to generate energy. It is highly polluting because some of the methane you produce will be emitted unburned to the atmosphere. There are far better uses of those crops, and so again, in the New York context, the state has decided to discourage that totally. It's even though we're a fairly large agricultural state, there are better uses of our farmland than growing crops in general for energy, and using those for methane production is just probably about the worst way to use those crops.
Would anyone else like to answer before we go to audience questions?
Turn it over to the audience.
All right. Our first question is, has the environmental cost of replacing functioning natural gas lines with electrical heat infrastructure been factored into the estimates in these presentations?
So I'm not sure what the question is referring to the environmental cost of replacing functional natural gas pipelines. I think I kind of get the gist of it. And in a number of our studies, and I can't quote the Illinois numbers off at the top of my head. Hopefully Abe might be able to chime in and talk about the report that Groundwork did for People's Gas. But we're talking about replacing gas pipelines in places like Chicago, in New York, in Massachusetts. We have in those jurisdictions, we have very old gas systems, 100-year-old leak-prone pipe that, to continue to use that, needs to be modernized in one way or another. So replacing those gas pipelines, those cast iron gas pipelines, with modern modern plastic pipes. That cost is actually quite enormous. In places like Massachusetts, we see the cost of replacing gas pipelines in my town here reaching about $100,000 per home in some instances. It gets enormously expensive. Abe is posting in the chat actually the number from our report. $12 billion in Illinois is the cost to modernize. $12 billion in Chicago is the cost to modernize leak-prone pipe. In Massachusetts, it's going to be somewhere around $15-16 million of upfront capital cost. I think New York is somewhere again in that 10, actually in the more so in the like the $20 billion range. So one of the things that we focus on very much at Groundwork Data is trying to identify opportunities to avoid those investments and basically save ratepayers, gas ratepayers money by bringing forward electrification in a strategic and actually coordinated way into neighborhoods. To again avoid that reinvestment of the gas system and get those homes onto electric heat sooner. And that actually delivers potentially significant cost savings, again, from that avoided gas infrastructure.
Yeah, and it's important to remember, buildings already have electric connections, right? So you're not building new electric infrastructure to connect heat pumps. Those buildings already have an electricity connection. You're just installing the heat pump. And so when you look at the cost to replace a furnace, and many of the furnace replacements are for aging furnaces that people need to replace anyways. They're cracked, they're leaking into people's homes, they're leaking gas into people's homes, which is a public health issue. And so when you think about replacing this aging technology with a heat pump, the cost makes sense. It is cheaper to replace something with a heat pump than to try and decarbonize using alternative fuels like RNG. And that's just looking at the cost of RNG. That's not taking into account the huge cost to replace pipeline infrastructure, like Michael was talking about.
All right, thank you both. Our next question, I'll just read it. It's a bit long, so I'm not sure that I can parse it out myself. There's a great deal of focus on RNG as a whole. There is also an emphasis on the fact that growing crops specifically for feedstocks or growing bovine agriculture to continue producing gas are problematic environmentally. But there's not much about digesters that only take food waste that would have gone to landfills anyway. So would the net environmental impact of these different sources of feedstock vary significantly?
Yeah, let me take a crack at that. The food waste, currently we're putting in landfills. That's terrible. It becomes methane and it leaks out over time, and you can try to capture it, but that's a terrible thing to be doing. So we want to stop putting food waste into landfills for sure into the future. Anaerobic digestion is one possibility, but it's difficult to run anaerobic digesters without having some of the methane go to the atmosphere. And again, methane is such a powerful greenhouse gas. One of the biggest issues with the digesters is that if you want to keep them running efficiently and effectively, economically, then you need to have a rapid throughput of the source material. You don't want to just hold it in bulk for long periods of time. You want to put in new material and take out some of the waste. That means that the waste that's coming out is still producing methane as it comes out. And what typically is done is that's held in open lagoons and the methane blows off in the atmosphere. So if we're going to do food waste, we need a better technology than people currently use for anaerobic digesters. There are other things we could do. We can turn them into, we can compost it. That does not produce methane and provides a fertilizer. There are many other things we could do with the food stock. I think anaerobic digestion is probably one of the least desirable ways to handle food waste, other than what we do now, which is sticking it in a landfill.
Right, thank you. And I'm going to actually move on to our next question just because I know it's something that we haven't touched on really in this presentation. But what do areas of the United States that rely heavily on fossil fuels for electricity generation do if we switch to electrification and they aren't already planning to switch to renewable energy?
I'll take this. I assume the question is about sort of the overall carbon intensity life cycle operations of electric heating of a heat pump. And it's really useful to note that for most of the year, these heat pumps, even when powered by natural gas, they are more they use less natural gas to generate heat than just burning that natural gas, because they take in that ambient heat, they harvest that ambient heat out of the atmosphere and use it internally. Now, I think the question is really important. We need to focus on rapidly decarbonizing our electricity system, and where that RNG resource may be available, such as that manure on a dairy farm, generate electricity from it, anaerobically digest it, put it to a fuel cell, do a combined heat and power plant, and hopefully use that heat for some local process on site. Turn that into a much more valuable commodity, a much more valuable product, electricity, that can address sort of local, sort of rural, electricity demand needs, infrastructure needs, and really supply that sort of low carbon electricity in those locations.
All right. Thank you very much.
Yeah, and I'll just add, this is exactly why we need to start transitioning our electric grid. This is why, so that we can have a whole solution to the building electrification issue. And renewables are more cost competitive now than coal, than natural gas. So what we really need to be doing is investing in our grid to make it so that these resources can come online and can reach customers.
Dr. Howarth, did you want to add anything?
Just sort of to restate, yes, we want to go to a renewable grid. We need to go to a renewable grid as quickly as we can. But to restate what Michael said, even if a heat pump is run on electricity made 100% from fossil fuels, the greenhouse gas consequences are less when you use the heat pump than if you use the fossil fuel directly. And that's because these heat pumps are incredible technology. They are extracting heat from the environment, air, or the groundwater. And for 1 unit of electric input in, they can produce 3, 5, 6 times more heat energy back out. So there's no reason to wait till we have a decarbonized grid to go with the heat pumps. We want to move ahead with both as quickly as we can.
All right, thank you. With that, we are right at time. So first, I want to extend a heartfelt thanks to all 3 of our panelists for being here today. I really appreciate it, and I'm sure our attendees do as well. To the attendees, we will be sending out a recording of this afterwards, along with the slides presented today. So yeah, thank you so much for being here, and thank you so much for your time, Jaimini, Dr. Howarth, and Walsh.
Thank you. Been fun.
Thank you.
Thank you.